My friends, I want to talk with you today about a question that weighs heavy on many hearts. Is going no contact sometimes selfish? Now, first, let's define what we mean by no contact. It's the decision to cut off communication with someone, whether a friend, a family member, or even a loved one, because the relationship has become damaging, unhealthy, or impossible to manage in peace. It's a step many people wrestle with because it carries the weight of both protection and pain. The question arises, am I being selfish if I choose no contact? To answer this, we must look at the motives of the heart. Selfishness says, I only care about myself and I don't mind if you suffer. But self-care, rooted in wisdom, says, I need to step away for healing, for clarity, and for peace, because remaining in this situation keeps both of us in harm's way. There's a difference, you see, between shutting someone out in bitterness and choosing distance in order to walk in wholeness. Healthy boundaries are not acts of cruelty, they are acts of stewardship. Just as you guard your home from an intruder, so too must you guard your spirit from what continually harms it. Now, is it possible to misuse no contact? Yes, it is. If our intent is to punish, manipulate, or make someone feel abandoned without cause, then we are not walking in love. But when the choice is made with prayer, with humility, and with discernment, it is not selfishness, it is wisdom. Remember, this silence, when guided by peace, can often speak louder than words filled with conflict. Walking away for a season may not be rejection, it may be the very space God uses to bring healing, both for you and for the other person. So, is going no contact sometimes selfish? The answer depends on the heart. When it flows from pride or anger, yes, it is selfish. But when it flows from a desire to preserve peace, protect well-being, and honor God with your choices, then it is not selfish. It is necessary. When we begin to talk about the idea of no contact, we first have to understand what that really means. People sometimes hear the phrase and assume it is simply a cold act of cutting someone out of your life without explanation. But the truth is, no contact is much more than that. It is a deliberate decision to step away from communication, from interaction, or even from presence in someone else's life, because the relationship has become too heavy, too harmful, or too unhealthy to continue in its present form. To make sense of whether or not it is selfish, we have to start with the very definition and purpose behind it. No contact can arise in a variety of situations. Think about a relationship that is filled with constant conflict, where every word turns into an argument. Or perhaps a family tie that has carried years of disappointment, unmet expectations, and emotional pain. Sometimes it may be a friendship that once was sweet but has now become toxic, manipulative, or one-sided. In each of these cases, the act of no contact does not come out of nowhere. It usually follows many attempts at reconciliation, many conversations that did not produce change, and many moments of prayer and reflection. The decision is rarely impulsive. It often comes after someone has reached the place of realizing that continuing to engage is only draining their spirit and leaving them in a cycle of hurt. When we define no contact properly, we see that it is not always about anger or punishment. Instead, it is about drawing a boundary where none has worked before. Just as we would close the door of our home to keep out what threatens our safety, so we sometimes close the door of interaction to protect our heart, our mind, and our peace. That protection does not mean we hate the other person. It does not mean we no longer care. It means we recognize that staying entangled in constant struggle helps neither side. One of the most important parts of understanding no contact is seeing that it is not necessarily permanent. For some, it is a season. Time apart so that wounds can heal, tempers can settle, and perspective can grow. In that sense, no contact can become a tool for restoration. Distance can sometimes do what presence cannot. It gives both people space to reflect, to see their own shortcomings, and perhaps to come back together later in a healthier way. For others, the separation may be longer or even indefinite, especially if there is ongoing abuse, manipulation, or refusal to change. In such cases, no contact becomes less about waiting for restoration and more about preserving one's well-being for the long term. Now, let us not mistake this decision for something light or easy. Anyone who has walked the road of no contact knows it carries grief. There is a mourning that takes place when you realize that connection is no longer possible in the way you hoped. The phone that once rang with laughter now sits silent, Holidays that were once shared may feel emptier. Yet, within that silence, there is also an opportunity to discover peace that had been long absent. To define no contact only as rejection misses this truth. It is not the absence of love, but often the presence of wisdom. To fully grasp this idea, we must also look at the heart behind it. Some may use no contact as a weapon, a way to inflict pain or to control another person. That is not healthy, and it does fall into selfishness. But when we define it in its true sense, no contact is not about controlling others at all. It is about controlling ourselves. It is about saying, I cannot continue to expose my heart to constant damage, so I will take responsibility for my own peace. Think about the example of physical health. If someone has a severe allergy, they will avoid the food that triggers it, not because they hate the food, but because their body cannot handle it. The food itself may not change, but the person must choose a boundary for the sake of survival. The same principle applies to relationships. Some environments continually harm us, and no matter how much we hope they will change, the safest choice is to step away. Defining no contact in this way helps us see it not as cruelty, but as stewardship of the soul, the mind, and the body. In summary, before we judge no contact as selfish or unkind, we must first define it clearly. It is the intentional act of creating distance for the sake of health, healing, and restoration. It may look different depending on the relationship, but at its core, it is a boundary born from wisdom rather than from spite. When understood this way, we begin to see that no contact is not an act of selfishness. It is an act of recognizing the value of peace and the necessity of protecting it. When we take the step of going no contact, one of the first questions that rises to the surface is whether we are acting out of selfishness or out of genuine self-care. The distinction between the two can seem subtle, but in reality it is very clear when we look at the motives of the heart. Selfishness says, I will do what I want, regardless of how it impacts others. My comfort is all that matters. Self-reflection, on the other hand, says, I need to pause and examine the health of this relationship, my own role in it, and the effect it is having on my spirit, so that I can make a choice that honors both God and myself. The difference rests in intention. Too often people confuse self-care with selfishness because both involve thinking about one's own needs. But the question we must ask is, why am I thinking about myself in this moment? If the answer is rooted in arrogance, pride, or disregard for another person's well-being, then it leans towards selfishness. But if the answer is rooted in the recognition that you cannot continue to carry harm, neglect, or abuse without consequence, then it becomes a matter of wisdom. Protecting your soul, your peace, and even your physical safety is not selfish. It is responsible. Self-reflection calls us to pause before we act. It asks us to consider, what is driving my decision to go no contact? Am I doing this simply because I don't want to deal with hard conversations? Or am I doing this because repeated conversations have brought no change and the situation continues to damage my heart? Am I trying to punish someone? Or am I choosing peace because constant engagement has become destructive? These honest questions allow us to separate the desire for control from the desire for clarity. Think of it this way: selfishness closes the door with bitterness, saying, you are no longer worth my time. But self-reflection closes the door with humility, saying, for this season, I cannot walk in this room without losing myself. I need to step away to regain strength. One slams the door, the other quietly locks it for protection. One acts out of anger, the other acts out of discernment. Another key difference lies in outcome. Selfish actions often leave behind destruction, resentment, and brokenness because they were rooted in pride. But decisions that flow from self-reflection, even when painful, have the potential to bring healing. By stepping away, you not only protect your own peace, but you also give space for the other person to examine themselves. Sometimes distance is the very thing that awakens awareness in someone else. Sometimes silence says more than arguments ever could. It is also important to remember that self-reflection does not absolve us from responsibility. When we choose no contact, we must still search our hearts. Were there moments when we contributed to the conflict? Were there words we spoke in anger that added to the hurt? Self-reflection is honest enough to admit our own shortcomings while still recognizing that remaining in the relationship as it is harmful. This humility protects us from falling into pride. We do not walk away saying, I am better than you. We walk away saying, I cannot continue like this, and I need God's wisdom to know what is right for me. Selfishness is often hasty, reactive, and fueled by emotions. It wants immediate relief without considering long-term consequences. Self-reflection, however, is patient. It weighs the decision, prays over it, and listens for wisdom. This is why some people take weeks, months, or even years before finally choosing no contact. It is not because they are uncertain of their pain. It is because they want to be certain that their choice is not driven by revenge, but by peace. We must also recognize that selfishness isolates us in a spirit of pride, while self-reflection protects us in a spirit of care. If I am selfish, I walk away with hardened heart, unwilling to see the humanity of the other person. If I am reflective, I walk away with compassion, even if distance is necessary. I may still pray for that person, still desire their healing, but I accept that I cannot be the one to bring it about. Ultimately, the difference between selfishness and self-reflection comes down to love. Selfishness is the absence of love, choosing only oneself without regard for another. Self-reflection still carries love, but it knows that love without boundaries is not true love at all. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for another is to step away. That step may feel heavy, but when guided by reflection rather than selfishness, it becomes an act of wisdom rather than cruelty. When we think about no contact, one of the most important principles to consider is the role of boundaries. Boundaries are not walls of hatred, they are lines of wisdom. They mark where one person's responsibility ends and another's begins. Without boundaries, relationships can easily become tangled, confused, and destructive. But when boundaries are respected, there is room for love to flourish, for peace to remain, and for each person to grow in a healthy way. The idea of boundaries is not something we invented out of convenience. It is woven into the very order of creation. Just as the seas have shores, just as the day has its limits before the night arrives, so too must our lives have limits. We cannot give endlessly without rest, without space, without balance. Boundaries are part of the way we honor both ourselves and the people around us. When it comes to relationships, boundaries take many forms. Sometimes a boundary is as simple as saying no to something that overextends us. Other times it may mean deciding how much time we can reasonably spend with someone without draining our spirit. In more difficult cases, boundaries may require significant distance, including no contact. This does not mean we no longer care about the other person. It means we recognize that remaining constantly available to harmful behavior does not help them, and it does not help us. One of the common misunderstandings about boundaries is that they are unkind. Many people are taught that love means always saying yes, always being available, always sacrificing. But healthy love does not mean constant surrender. True love has to be anchored in truth. And truth says that you and I are limited. We are not meant to carry the weight of another person's anger, manipulation, or abuse without ever setting limits. Boundaries do not destroy love. They preserve it by preventing love from being twisted into control or resentment. Think of it like a garden. If you do not put a fence around a garden, wild animals may come and trample the plants, eat the fruit, or dig up the soil. The fence does not mean you hate the outside world. It means you are protecting what is precious within. In the same way, when you set boundaries in your life, you are protecting your heart, your peace, and your calling. Without those protections, the constant trampling of unhealthy relationships can rob you of the very life you are meant to live. There are times when setting boundaries feels painful, especially with those closest to us. Family members, close friends, or even long-term partners can make us feel guilty for drawing a line. They may say, "If you really loved me, you wouldn't pull away." But the truth is the opposite. If we really love wisely, we must know when closeness has crossed into harm. Love without boundaries enables destruction. Love with boundaries seeks healing. No contact, when done with wisdom, is simply the strongest form of boundary. It is saying, I cannot continue in this pattern because it destroys both of us. For my sake, and perhaps for yours as well, there must be distance. Boundaries are also a way of trusting God. When we set them, we are acknowledging that we cannot change another person. We are saying, I release this situation into hands greater than mine. Often, the fear of setting boundaries comes from the desire to control. We think, if I just stay and keep trying, Maybe they will change, but boundaries remind us that change is not ours to manufacture. Sometimes stepping away creates the very space that allows God to work in ways we never could. It is also worth noting that boundaries are not only for protecting ourselves, but also for protecting others. When someone mistreats us and we do not set a boundary, we allow them to continue in their harmful behavior unchecked. Distance sometimes confronts them with a truth they would never face if we kept enabling their actions. In this way, boundaries can actually become an act of love toward the other person because they remove the opportunity for continued harm. So when we ask whether going no contact is selfish, we must remember that it is simply one expression of a deeper principle, the principle of boundaries. These boundaries are not meant to divide us from others in hate, but to allow us to live in peace, to maintain our well-being, and to leave room for relationships to either heal or be released. Without them, we lose ourselves. With them, we give ourselves the chance to thrive in truth and love. When we consider the idea of going no contact, one of the most misunderstood aspects is the role of silence. Many people see silence as weakness, avoidance, or even punishment, but purposeful silence is none of these things. It is not the silence of indifference, nor is it the silence of revenge. It is the silence of wisdom. It is the silence that says, I will no longer participate in cycles of conflict that produce no fruit. I will no longer pour words into a space where words are continually misused, ignored, or twisted. Purposeful silence is not the absence of thought. It is the presence of deep reflection. It is a decision that comes after much wrestling, after weighing the consequences, after realizing that sometimes words cannot heal what distance can. Every argument does not need another response, every insult does not deserve a reply, and every toxic cycle cannot be solved by endless conversations. There comes a point when silence carries more power than speech. When we examine relationships that require no contact, we often find a history of repeated conversations that went nowhere. You may have tried to explain how you felt, to plead for understanding, to outline the changes that were needed. But instead of resolution, you were met with denial, blame, or further conflict. After enough attempts, you realize that your words are falling on closed ears. Continuing to speak becomes like pouring water into a cup with no bottom. It takes your energy, but nothing is retained. In these moments, silence becomes the most honest response. Silence, however, should not be confused with apathy. Purposeful silence comes with prayer, discernment, and clarity. It is not about refusing to feel, but about choosing not to fuel. By stepping back, you are not saying the other person is worthless. You are saying that the situation as it stands is fruitless. That is an important distinction. It reframes silence from rejection into protection. In many ways, silence is also a teacher. It teaches us patience because we must resist the urge to defend ourselves every time we are misunderstood. It teaches us humility because we learn that not every battle must be fought with words. It teaches us faith because we trust that truth does not always need our constant defense. Sometimes truth stands best when we step aside and let it speak in its own time. Purposeful silence can also create space for healing. Constant interaction in a broken relationship often keeps wounds open because every exchange reopens the hurt. Silence acts like a bandage, giving time for scars to form and strength to return. This does not guarantee reconciliation, but it does guarantee that you will not keep injuring yourself in the same way. Sometimes, silence is what allows perspective to develop for you and for the other person. What cannot be seen in the noise of conflict may become clear in the quiet of separation. It is also true that silence protects dignity. Arguments can easily push us into saying things we later regret, into lowering ourselves in ways that damage our character. By choosing silence, you remove yourself from situations where your words might be used against you or where your peace might be stolen by constant strife. It is not weakness to remain silent. It is strength to hold back when everything in you wants to react. That said, silence should not be chosen lightly. It must be purposeful, not passive. If the motive is to manipulate, to make the other person feel abandoned, or to exert control, then it ceases to be purposeful silence and becomes silent treatment, a tactic of punishment. But when the motive is to find peace, to guard your well-being, and to create space for healing, silence becomes a wise boundary. The heart behind it determines whether it is selfish or self-protective. In the end, purposeful silence is not about turning your back on people. It is about turning your face toward peace. It is the recognition that words have been exhausted and that the healthiest choice is to let go. No contact, guided by this kind of silence, is not a declaration of hate. It is a commitment to live in wisdom. And often, the quiet decision to walk away speaks louder than any speech you could ever give.